Hello everyone and welcome back to our fifth and final unit of the semester. We are going to be exploring an entire decade, the 1920s, in this lecture, and in this unit, we're going to cover it over a series of 3 lectures, and this one's going to be a little bit unique. Most of the time we focus on politics and, war, things like that. Here we're going to be focused a little bit more on society and social changes that are occurring in the 1920s. Now, with that being said, today we are going to touch on some politics. We're going to look at the presidency of Warren G. Harding and some of the how that reflected some of the changes going on in American society. But later on, second and third lectures are going to focus quite heavily on how roles of women are changing, and how labor is changing, and how America has emerged after World War I as one of the more powerful nations in the world. We are not at that elite tier, though, not yet. In fact, even with our participation in World War I, we are still seen as kind of a middle-range country. An industrial power, perhaps, without a doubt. I mean, we have the #1 industry in the world after the Industrial Revolution. But even on the precipice of World War II, we are seen as kind of a weaker military power. So anyways, we're gonna examine this decade and the changes that are happening in kind of a somewhat different manner than what we usually do. So get your notes ready, and we'll go ahead and begin. Well, here we go, the 1920s, and I've got some famous figures up here that some of which you may recognize, and music and art and even the criminal underground are going to make an appearance in our lecture over the next few days. So let's take a look. It's called the Roaring Twenties, and there is a reason. Man, it was an era of prosperity, seemingly limitless prosperity. Things are changing quite rapidly for America, and we are starting to come into our own here. So to begin with, we have to remember that this decade comes at the very end of World War I. 1918, the war comes to an end. 1919, the Treaty of Versailles is pushed out. So even though we helped write that, we were still dealing with a number of issues back home. And I alluded to this in our World War I unit that, in history we like to bookend wars and say it began here and it ended here. That usually just refers to the conflict itself. For those that fight and engage in it or have been affected by it, the war never ends. And, for the first time on a global scale, Americans are seeing the death and devastation that a war has caused. Now, going back to the Spanish-American War, we saw that America was becoming more interventionist, disregarding our former isolationist ways. We're going to return in the 1920s to that more isolationist stance because, frankly, Americans were horrified at what they saw just in a single year's fighting in World War I and the amount of Americans dead. So, Warren G. Harding is going to run in the 1920s under a motto of a return to normalcy. Well, what does that mean? Obviously, getting back to how things were. But in both good and bad ways, we're going to see not only a return to that isolationist stance where the United States is going to stay out of European, in particular, affairs, but global affairs. We're going to return more to kind of what's happening here at home. But not all of that focus is positive. We are going to see a return to nativism. We're going to see a very strong wave of anti-immigration policies, and we're going to see, in fact, a number of immigrants even get accused of crimes like murder that becomes very sadly prevalent during this period. So xenophobia is on the rise, and a major suspicion of foreigners. Overall, this decade is going to be fairly conservative in terms of governmental interference with taxes and regulations. We're going to see a return to how things were really before that progressive era, in which government kind of allowed business to do what they wanted and stayed out of their affairs. Now, one big event that has happened recently in the world that makes a major impact in the United States is the Russian Revolution. And we talked about the revolution in our World War I unit. In 1917, Russia does become a communist nation. Now, even though that may not have directly affected us, Americans are reading about this in the newspaper, and they're seeing that a popular revolution has overthrown an entire government, one in which America was friendly to, and has replaced it with a system that is completely opposite of the American system, not only in terms of economic systems, going from a capitalist society, and frankly they were more feudalistic, Russia was so backward at the time, but instead of a capitalist society, the communist leaders of this revolution have installed a communist economic system in which there is no private property. People are basically told by the government where to live, what to do. And in many ways, this is the exact opposite of the American way of life, where we are very distrustful of the government, and what you earn, you keep, or at least that's what's supposed to happen. So people are becoming very scared that a similar revolution could happen here. This becomes known as the Red Scare, the fear of communism in the United States. And in the 1920s, we're going to see this take hold. And we're going to see a number of actions taken by the government in order to try and stop the spread of communism here. So, one of those, the ways that they tried to spread communism, or stop communism from spreading, was by arresting those who had ties to communism. The man pictured in the upper right is the Attorney General, kind of the head lawyer for the time, A. Mitchell Palmer. And Palmer is going to allow a series of raids onto suspected communist homes in which you can see some of the pictures there of ransacking these homes. And Palmer officially stated that what they were searching for was un-American activities. Now, I want you to remember that phrase, un-American, and we're going to come back to that later on because this is the first Red Scare. We're going to see an even more intense Red Scare that happens after World War II when Russia really does become the major enemy of the United States. But what does that term un-American mean? Because, for many people, being American means that you have the freedom to learn what you want and to study what you want. But in this era, that is becoming limited. People that even had literature about these other economic systems could find themselves being arrested and their homes torn apart by these Palmer raids. So it went pretty far in trying to prevent this spread here, but I think most historians would agree that it actually kind of tipped the scale the other way, and we began to actually violate rights to try and root out, frankly, what wasn't a threat in the first place. Now, I mentioned in a previous unit in our Reform era unit that there was a sad case of Sacco and Vanzetti. And, before I begin, these two men were Italian immigrants, and they were not good guys. They were not angels. They both had criminal records, and they, were known by the police, and ultimately one night they were both arrested for a murder that had happened in Boston. And the trial was rushed through very quickly, and both men, to their dying day, pleaded that they were not guilty, that they were innocent of this crime. They believed that they were only being found guilty and executed because they were immigrants and anarchists that didn't fit the mold of what it meant to be an American at the time. And frankly, most historians, I think, tend to agree with them at this point. In fact, 50 years later, in the 1970s, you actually had the governor of Massachusetts issue a pardon for both men, saying that the trial had been unfair, that they had been accused wrongly, and that this trial had kind of been a sham. Now, the reason we're talking about this here is because this is one example of that, sadly, return to normalcy, a return to nativism and xenophobic behavior in which we see Americans point the finger and, frankly, scapegoat immigrants for being different. And in this case, these two men paid with their lives. It didn't just end with immigrants, though. It was extended beyond that. The Ku Klux Klan is going to be revived in the 1920s, and frankly, it is stronger than ever before. There have been kind of different phases of the Klan. After the Civil War, it was kind of primarily in the South, and it was mainly to keep the Southern way of life. Now, of course, that mainly targeted blacks, and it tried to terrorize them by keeping them from participating in their political system, and it worked. I mean, it was terrorism. The amount of black participation in terms of voting, was decimated in the first few years after they gained the right to vote, because frankly they were under so much threat of violence that they refused to. I mean, why would you risk your life and your home just to cast your vote? A lot of people didn't think it was worth it. So what we see here, though, is kind of the second installment of the Ku Klux Klan. And frankly, they've broadened their horizons to include a lot more minority groups than just African Americans. The Klan of the 1920s is going to focus mainly on the immigrants. They are going to focus on people like Catholics. They're going to focus on Jews. They're going to focus on really anyone that was born outside of the United States. Now, you would be remiss if you reminded these people that most likely either their parents or their grandparents, or maybe even a couple of generations more, had been immigrants themselves, but they believe so strongly in white superiority that they are proudly demonstrating in the streets. You can see the protests here. I believe this was before one of the presidential inaugurations, but the Klan actually taking to the streets and publicly, showing this white superiority, and you can see that their numbers rose to upwards of 4.5 million members. In fact, some members of Congress were open KKK members. So this is a dangerous time for a lot of different people, and we're seeing a rise of anger and hatred towards these massive waves of immigrants that have come into our country. But here, the KKK is kind of the strongest that it's ever been, and that would change throughout the decades, but there's a resurgence of hate in the 1920s, and it's very sad to see. Now, labor had gone through a number of changes as well. Remember, in World War I, we talked about how a lot of jobs had become open because men had gone over to fight. 4 million men had left their jobs and had gone to fight. So a lot of factory jobs were open, and you had women take those roles. You had minorities take those roles who previously would not have been allowed to work in those occupations. In World War I, the government had actually clamped down on the ability of workers to strike, as it was seen as a detriment to their ability to produce goods. And so basically you have this kind of return of the labor struggle in the 1920s, as well as workers demand fair wages and safe working conditions. So this will revive itself as another major issue. So again, return to normalcy. Perhaps the old normal wasn't necessarily the best America, but we have some examples here. In 1919, the Boston police strike. We had policemen going on strike out of lack of pay and different items. Interesting here, the future president, but current governor, Calvin Coolidge, actually called in the National Guard to force the police officers to go back to work. In this instance, the government is saying that these police officers don't have the right to strike because in reality they're striking against the public safety. And so anyways, just understand that labor is still going on. I had mentioned the steel mill strike in a previous lecture. This was one of the largest strikes, and it took place in the 1920s. Almost 500,000 men and women took part in this strike about bad working conditions, and they took to the streets to protest that. So a return to hate, a return to nativism, xenophobia, labor issues are reviving. What about some maybe good things that are happening here? Well, Warren G. Harding, who is an interesting president to say the least, and I won't get into some of his more scandalous activities. You're free to browse Wikipedia to read about those. But Warren G. Harding did seek to have America shine as a beacon of world peace. He picked up where Wilson had left off, and he did help sign what became known as the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which was signed by 64 nations after World War I, that basically promised to avoid war if possible, right? To not jump to conclusions, to not use their military as the first, line of defense, of actually have some diplomacy. Hey, great idea. It's all nice. We're all hugging each other. In reality, though, all it takes is one country. All it takes is one, I don't know, say Germany, to say, we don't want world peace. We want to invade Poland. And then everybody else is sitting around still hugging each other. So the Kellogg-Briand Pact, it was a great idea and sentiment, but in reality, there's no way to enforce nations not to go to war with one another. So you're seeing a little bit of kind of the zeitgeist of the time, if you will. Tariffs. We do see the issue of tariffs come up again. I told you when we covered this the first time, this would not be the last. Again, a tariff is a tax on imports, and we've seen them recently. In 2016, the U.S. under President Trump had a lot of new tariffs that were put in place to try and protect American industry. Nothing wrong with that idea, but as we've seen in some of those industries, there's always responses to these things. And this is when that Fordney-McCumber tariff comes into place. And I think we mentioned this in our last unit, but the tariffs were raised by 60%. So taxes had gone up 60% on imports. And what that meant was it became very costly to buy any imported good, which might sound, okay, that's fair. So you buy American, which will cost you more. But the fact is, what this does is it causes retaliatory tariffs to be put in place, and other nations follow suit, and they place very high tariffs on us. It's the same thing that happened in 2016. We put high tariffs on China, and they turned around and put high tariffs on us. So a number of goods that you buy are now all of a sudden a lot more expensive. Also, it affected numerous industries. More recently, especially soybean. And in the part of the country where we live, soybean farmers have been hurt drastically by Chinese tariffs placed on our soybean, and they're not buying it anymore. So it's the same thing that happened in the 1920s, because once these tariffs go up, everybody else puts them up, and global trade slows to a halt. Now, I will tell you, we are in the beginning. We're kind of in those interwar years in which everything that is happening here is building up to the next war. And when you slow down global trade, it means that countries are no longer able to do business, including countries that owe tremendous debts like Germany. It got so bad, Germany owed about $10 billion at this point to France for their war debt, which they were not too happy to be paying, by the way. It got so bad that Germany kind of defaulted on this loan, and France actually invaded part of Germany. It looked as if we're about to have World War II right away. Thankfully, the United States did intervene, but they really kind of put a Band-Aid on somebody who just had their arm cut off. This was a temporary halt to the problem. It did not tackle the problem itself, but we came up with what was called the Dawes Plan. And what we did was we loaned Germany $2.5 billion. We gave them cash. They owed us back with interest. But follow the money, right? We give money to Germany. They give money to the Entente powers. Well, the Entente powers had been buying from the biggest industrial power in the world to supply their war and to feed their people in those years where the war was raging, and that's the United States. So it's circular. We give money to Germany, they give it to France, and France owes us debt, so they give it right back. All this plan did was kind of halt the military action at the time, which is good, but it just created more debt overall. It didn't actually solve any of the issues. Now, also back at home, we are seeing a return to an immigration restriction program. And in 1921, there's what's called the Emergency Quota Act, which established a maximum amount of immigrants that could come from each country. Now, we've already seen this a little bit with the Chinese Exclusion Act, which actually banned any immigrants from China, at the same time allowing literally millions of people in from Western Europe, but banning Chinese immigration. But here we're slowing down immigration in its totality. So we're seeing, again, kind of a return to that fear of foreigners coming in, changing our way of life, and it is being put into policy. Now, Warren G. Harding had some good people around him. Herbert Hoover which would sadly kind of become the villain of the Great Depression. I think a lot of undue blame gets extended to Herbert Hoover, who becomes president later on. But at this time, he is the acting Secretary of Commerce. He had actually kind of been a hero in World War I for his handling of the food crisis that was going on in Europe. People were starving in Europe, and Americans were able to basically sell them very cheaply goods. So we were able to sell them food during World War I, and Hoover was the main man behind that program. So he is placed as the head of the Secretary of Commerce, and like I said, on his path to the presidency. One other name that we've mentioned in the past, Andrew Mellon, who was at this point one of the world's wealthiest men. He is picked to be in charge of the Department of the Treasury. So what better person to put in charge of the budget and the doings on and the spending of government, but Andrew Mellon. And things like the national debt did decrease by upwards of a third during that period. There were some policies put in place that led us to downfall later on, but in at least the short term, it appeared as if Mellon was doing a lot of good things to try and alleviate the debt. But that's kind of where it ended for Harding's crew, because Harding was still kind of adhering to that old spoils system. And he had hooked up a lot of his buddies back from Ohio with high-ranking jobs in the government, and they were corrupt. They became known as the Ohio Gang, and one of the worst scandals in American history took place under Harding's administration, called the Teapot Dome scandal. The basis for this scandal was that the United States still held a number of lands out west, and some of those lands had things like oil inside them. Now, what happened in the Teapot Dome scandal was there was this location known as Teapot Dome, this land that the Secretary of the Interior, the person who is in charge of all of America's internal lands that the government owns, Albert B. Fall, was renting, basically loaning out that land to oil companies and basically taking a kickback for some of the oil that was being produced from those publicly owned lands. Well, this was a major scandal. You cannot benefit from publicly owned lands, and you definitely couldn't just give it to the highest bidder. So this began to, once it was found out, it really began to kind of do a waterfall where there was a lot of corruption that ended up being exposed, and a lot of the Ohio gang got wrapped up and eventually arrested. Harding realizes that his image is quite tarnished from this event, and so he decides to go on a goodwill tour. And so he travels by train around the country, basically, saying that he didn't have any connection to these guys, and he wants to get back to business. Well, while he's on this very grueling tour, he ends up getting sick and he dies. And when Harding dies, as the line of succession works, the vice president became the president of the United States. Well, that man was Calvin Coolidge, Silent Cal, if you will. He was known to be a man of very few words. In fact, I've heard a story about one dinner party he had at the White House where, an hour had gone by in this dinner party where President Coolidge hadn't said a word to anyone. And one woman actually was kind of prodding him a little bit and said, Mr. President, I bet I can get you to say more than 2 words by the end of the night. And he just looked at her and he said, "You lose." So I've always thought that was kind of funny. But anyways, Americans are, it's changing. America has changed. And, even though we looked primarily at politics in this lecture, next time we're going to take a look at how the individual American is starting to change in this new system, and how Americans are becoming more prosperous and on their way to becoming the most prosperous people in the world, and some of the technological innovations that allow us to get there. But that'll do it for lecture number 1. As always, please, if you have any questions, do not be afraid to ask, either in the comments or shoot me an email, and I'd be happy to reply. Thanks.